the Celts were so good at embracing nature, and the Celts knew that there were certain places and trees and stones and locations that had, they called them thin spaces, that the veil between heaven and earth, the here and hereafter, was very thin. And so that's often where they had ceremonies, and churches at the beginning over there were in an oak grove. That was just their natural cathedral. So I think learning from both your own desires, where you feel most alive in nature, and it can be wherever, pay attention to that, because that's where the divine is already stirring. And the Celts show that you can find that anywhere.
Welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In this episode, I'll be talking with Kelly Deutsch, founder of Spiritual Wanderlust, an organization that supports people on their path to wholeness and intimacy with the divine. This includes encouraging people to engage spirit and nature, a connection that Earthkeepers care very much about. In our conversation, we discuss how Celtic spiritual practices in particular can inspire us to sense God in all of creation. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Welcome, Kelly, to the podcast. We're really glad to have you. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about yourself and your community, and what are some of the things you're invested in these days?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here. So I am the director of Spiritual Wanderlust, which is a center for spiritual formation. So our whole goal at Spiritual Wanderlust is to really support people on their path to wholeness and divine union. And we like to use all the gifts available to us from the contemplative tradition, modern psychology, and wisdom of the ages. So it's kind of a fun blend of things. And I'm really passionate about being able to provide these things for all of us who are just starving for depth and community. Those I find are the two big pillars of what we're doing here, is providing those two things. So I'm delighted to be able to do this kind of work full time.
Well, tell us a bit more about Spiritual Wanderlust, and perhaps about the contemplative monk as well, and how those two things meet the needs of the people who are coming to you.
So Spiritual Wanderlust and Contemplative Monk are sister organizations. So Contemplative Monk was founded by Bob Holmes a number of years ago, and so he and I direct it together, and I consider that the front door to what we're doing. So we share on a daily basis bits of wisdom, inspiration. Bob sometimes shares some of his writings and poetry and things like that. And that has a pretty massive following. You know, we're at almost 1 million followers. And so lots of folks follow that just for kind of a little daily shot in the arm. A Spiritual Wanderlust then is for folks who are really hungry to go deeper. So it's active formation with classes, there's spiritual direction, podcast. And it's interesting to me how many people we have that are in our community that are either spiritual but not religious folks, or that are post-evangelical. So we find a lot of folks, they've done the whole deconstruction thing, like, that didn't work for me, it was a little too rigid or whatever. A lot of often trauma and crisis come from there. But there's not a whole lot of work being done in reconstruction. Once people gain that spark back, or that sense of curiosity, like, what is out there and what do I want and what do I believe? I get really excited about that stage of the game. And so finding all of these people who are starving for embodiment, ritual, earthiness, feminine, mystical, and I'm like, oh, that's the formation that I've received in my background being in the convent. I was delighted to find out there's this whole subculture of ex-evangelicals and others who are hungry for all of this. And so it was kind of a happy marriage there. So we have lots of fun things.
I wonder what has happened in terms of post-COVID realities. Do you find that that was part of this deconstruction? And do you find that people are coming to you because of experiences in COVID, because of rethinking, reevaluating, questioning that they might have done?
There are definitely folks who have shared, like, I just haven't gone back to church for a variety of reasons. Pre-COVID, I feel like it was more some specific crisis, like my church is not affirming of gay and lesbian and queer folks, so that's not okay. And during COVID, though, I feel like some people are just like, it's just not doing it for me. I don't feel like I'm being fed. I'm not getting the depth. I want something with meat on the bones, like give me something I can sink my teeth into. And I have talked to a lot of pastors as well who have said the same thing. For a whole variety of reasons, people just aren't coming back post-COVID. And so that's honestly when I expect them to start finding things like Spiritual Wanderlust or Richard Rohr or Cynthia Bourgeault or some of these other folks in the contemplative tradition who are doing good things.
I think in the experience of Earthkeepers and Circlewood, because we really deal with things at the intersection of nature and spirit, we hear a lot about people who during COVID, when they weren't able to be with their religious community, were actually seeking spiritual experience, a sense of God in nature. So did a lot of hiking, increased their camping, spent a lot more time outdoors, just even in local parks.
Yeah, and it's just such a natural human thing to do. You look at almost any indigenous tradition in the world, and like, nature is a very important part of that. It's just part of human nature. So that's not surprising to me.
Well, you also have a podcast. What will some of our listeners expect when they inevitably go to the podcast and listen to you?
So I really love intersections as well. So I love talking about big questions that have to do with brain science and the contemplative life, or a hermit who's a journalist, or ableism and spiritual practice. We've had so many really fascinating conversations, from spiritual teachers to embodiment experts. Like we talked to this guy who is a practitioner of this Russian Orthodox martial arts, which I've never heard of, but it's just
really
fascinating. Like,
amazing.
Wow, so not all martial arts are Eastern. But, there's like a neuroscientist who dabbles in the Enneagram and brings those things together, or some artists. We talked to an opera singer, a sculptor, and a painter about spirituality that moves them. So just, to me, it's an exploration of the inner life and all that means for people who are actively engaged in that.
Well, we'll talk a lot more about the work that you're doing, but I do want listeners to know a bit more about your personal story, which from what I know of it is fascinating. Tell us, if you would, about the life journey that led you to where you are today.
I'll start with a shortened version, and you can ask whatever curiosities that you have.
Sure.
So I spent most of my life thinking I was going to be a nun. So from the age of 14, I really felt drawn and was like, I want to give my life to others and share this love that I'd found. And so in my 20s, I entered the convent, first in the US, and then I got shipped over to Rome, over in Italy, for formation. That's what most people will call novitiate. For those who are completely novice to all of religious life, just think Fraulein Maria, like The Sound of Music, that kind of thing. A little more modern example. So I was over in Rome, studied over there, did lots of wonderful things with this community. Their whole focus was spiritual formation and spiritual direction, which is what I love. So that was a wonderful place. There are lots of beautiful things and lots of really hard things. You learn very quickly when you're in the church world, and religious life is no different, that people are people, and that also brings a lot of brokenness. And I think that was a little surprising for me. But I had been there for a few years and basically had this mysterious illness that suddenly came upon me. I remember I was in the mountains in northern Italy, and I started to feel like super off, and kind of had throughout the year. And the sisters are like, I'm sure it's just the altitude. I'm like, okay. Except within a couple of weeks, I was like bedridden and had to be flown home in a wheelchair, never to return again. Like, it was just life turned on a dime. I ended up spending like 18 months mostly bedridden back at home in South Dakota, being shuttled from doctor to doctor, trying to figure out what was going on. And that experience was really pivotal for me. It really drop-kicked me into the second half of life. We talk about the first and second half of life, first being things are very black and white, and you know who's in and who's out, and there's a lot more clinging to certitude. And the second half of life is much more technicolor. There's a lot more nuance and shades and just okayness with mystery. So that really happened with illness, because when life falls apart, whether it is through illness or some other crisis, you tend to lose the three big things of your identity, your sense of mission or purpose, and your community, or where you feel like you belong. And so without all of those things, I was just reeling and had a lot of really beautiful growth that happened at that time, but it was also very painful. So to make a long story short, as I slowly convalesced, got better, I ended up working part-time in the corporate world. And as my health improved, I ended up getting in learning and development. And so I did some executive coaching and just different soft skill training, like communication skills and things like that. And I was delighted to discover that that wasn't all that different from spiritual direction and formation. We just called it business skills instead of virtue, like teaching people how not to be an asshole. And yeah, was happy to discover that. But I missed doing spiritual formation full time. And so I started dabbling in that just part-time, doing spiritual direction, wrote a book, things like that. And then a few years ago, I was like, let's do this for real. So I pulled the corporate plug and started doing Spiritual Wanderlust full time and offering different classes and exciting things for folks.
I think that probably some listeners have a fascination with the nun part of your story, because I do think that for many people, there is that urge, or at least that dream, like, what if I could only focus on the spiritual life and serving? Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, was the experience maybe what you expected it to be, or was it more? Was it different?
Good question. Yes and no. There was a lot that was beautiful and good. Being able to spend time in prayer every day, especially so the particular community that I was a part of had 4 hours of prayer each day. About an hour and a half of that was silent prayer. Others was liturgy the hours, praying the Psalms together, meditation together, the rosary, different things like that comprised our prayer life. So that was really wonderful. I think the surprising part for me, I suppose it's kind of like the honeymoon phase when you get married and you're like, we're different and we're going to love each other forever. You just have these starry eyes entering into it. And I tried to be realistic entering in, but like I said, some of the dysfunction that you'll find, you're not immune to it when you're in religious life. You think that whatever toxic personalities or even just difficult personalities, you're like, no, I'm going to run away to the monastery so I don't have to deal with all this craziness in my family or at work. It's like, no, people are still people. And that's the tough part. And that's, I think, the eye-opening part. I remember my spiritual director over in Italy was an Australian priest, and I was sharing some of this stuff with him. And I remember him looking me in the eyes and he's like, Kelly, your sisters have psychoses. I was like, oh, like, thank you for saying that, because I was like, am I the crazy one? Like, what's going on here? So I think that was surprising, along with seeing how different the Catholic Church looks when you're close to the Vatican. Way more bureaucratic and still has that weird princely feel. In the US, I was very used to priests and bishops being very pastoral, personable. There, you kind of get the impression the bishops still want you to kiss their ring. I was like, oh, okay, that's new. So yeah, lots of surprising things and lots of beautiful things, because also when you have the name like sister or brother or father in front of your name, people also treat you differently. And they're like, oh, sister, you kind of have this automatic status. So I think perhaps the surprising part for me as I left the convent was I didn't realize how much I clung to that, feeling special because I was a sister. So that was also a surprise.
Do you miss it?
Some aspects, absolutely. Yeah, there are aspects that were just delightful. And I loved living in Italy. There's just so much culture and art and the warmth of the Italian people. It was just such a beautiful thing. But at the same time, I'm so thankful for how the divine fulfills our desires in surprising ways. I entered there to be able to share some of this richness and receive more of this that I was so hungry for. And to see how that desire, that longing could be fulfilled in another form of life that I didn't anticipate is also really beautiful. So yes, I miss some aspects, but also the most important parts I get to live still now.
So we talked about intersections a bit earlier, and I think you also are interested in that intersection of spirituality and nature. And it does make me curious how that came to be, in terms of the early influences in your life. How was your relationship to nature inspired and encouraged?
South Dakota would encompass my answer. I grew up in the Midwest outside of a small town. So we were just surrounded by field and forest and sky. And the sky in particular, the clouds and the stars were my earliest mentors. They ripped open my heart. And that, to me, there's a language that nature speaks, especially the sky, that has no words, but we know it in the depths of our soul. It's our native language because we are a part of this beautiful thing of nature. And finding that from a young age, like I remember getting off the school bus and just flinging my backpack on the ground and lying on the ground and looking up at the clouds and just lying there. I was like third grade or something. And there's something that much space and awe will do to you. And also being out in nature that much, being exposed on the prairie, you are one with nature, whether you like it or not. I'm just the weather that would come in, you saw it coming from miles away, like, oh man, there's a massive thunderstorm coming. And I remember the first time being in town when a thunderstorm was, and it just suddenly was like banging against the windows. And I hadn't even seen, it was just such a strange experience because most of us who are in towns or cities are much more insulated from nature. But the winds, the weather, and the seasons, whether from the garden and harvesting and things like that, but even the games that you play when you're a kid. I just remember playing, like in the fall, we'd play this chicken and fox game with the apples that fell from the tree and the leaves that fell. And then in the winter, there'd be games that were very specific with the snow and the ice. And I think all of those things formed me and formed those of us who are blessed to grow up in those kinds of environments, just to live with the rhythms of nature and not be quite so insulated from that. So those are very formative years for me.
What's funny is when I read that part of your story about South Dakota, I just immediately had this image come to my mind. And I don't know if you're familiar with the painting called The Song of the Lark. It's essentially a peasant woman walking through the fields, and the sun is really low on the horizon behind her. And she's just singing to the sky. I remember seeing it first as an undergraduate in Chicago at the Art Institute, and was just so moved by it because she, I think, was evidencing this relationship that you're talking about.
Yeah.
You had to wonder, who is she singing to and what is she singing? But you knew there was something deep and numinous about her experience in that moment. So if you get a chance, you might want to look it up online. Again, the painting's called Song of the Lark, and the artist is Jules Breton.
Beautiful.
Well, a lot of people are coming to your organization searching for something. What sorts of needs are they bringing, and what are some of the deep questions they're posing as they come?
Yes, good question. A lot of people are wondering what's next. Like I mentioned, a lot of folks are transitioning from deconstruction to reconstruction and are just hungry for more. The other thing that I find is people come with longing because they've experienced something profound, something intimate, beautiful, often beyond words. And it might have been on a silent retreat. It might have just been when they were on a nature walk and they saw a wild fox for the first time, or a beautiful encounter with their family, or just a deep, nagging knowing that there is a love that knows no bounds. Could be very simple or it could be profound, but they've tasted something and they're like, I want more. Where do I go from? How do I? So they're starting spiritual practices and they're reading books and they're listening to podcasts with this voracious hunger for more of that. And I remember one of the first friends that I made in this kind of post-evangelical world was my friend Mitch. And he was saying, I won't use his exact language on this podcast, but basically it was like, F enlightenment, I want union. Heck with all of this woke culture. And he's like, I mean, that's fine, whatever, but I want union with this unspeakable mystery. And that's, I think, what drives people the most to spiritual wanderlust. Even the name itself connotes that kind of longing, the longing that leads you on like an eat, pray, love, and you go to India and you're trying to like find yourself or find this something with a capital S. So those are the questions that drive people the most who are coming to spiritual wanderlust.
I would imagine that whether they come to you with pain or not, that probably many people discover the need for healing as well. Is that the case?
100%. Absolutely. I'll speak about that in two ways, because one is the healing that needs to happen in deconstruction. And that's why I think that's a very important phase. I don't want people to rush all of their questions, because a lot of that really is just working with trauma. A lot of times you've been hurt by church, religion, different things in that world, and that takes a lot of processing. And it really is that grief process where sometimes you're grappling and trying to negotiate with it. Like, maybe if I just do this, then I'll feel comfortable in church, or different stages of depression and anger. And that's all healthy and good. Once people are at that place of relative acceptance, it's not like they'll never get angry again by any means, but feel like, okay, I can go on living my life. Then it's like, all right, so what now? I remember going through my own falling apart and wondering if I'd ever wonder at the world again. Is that gone forever? And that's scary, but fortunately it can return. So there is that stage of healing in the deconstruction. But I will also say, even when you're in reconstruction, once you commit yourself to inner work, you start to recognize a lot of other things that are going on in there. That's why I'm such a fan of inner work, and just, it's so incredibly crucial to spiritual life. Otherwise, we end up spiritually bypassing, doing all of that baptizing of toxic behavior. Oh, I'm just being nice. It's like, well, maybe you're actually just not standing up for yourself and having boundaries. So that's why inner work is so important, because it's part of the transformation process. If people are doing spiritual practices, but their lives aren't being transformed, there's something missing. And so that's where that process of inner work and healing comes in, so that you start doing the deep down work internally that just comes along with being human.
How would you describe or maybe define that term inner work in case people have not heard that before? How would you characterize it?
Inner work is engaging with your desires, your behaviors, your patterns, your inclinations, all of those things that happen interiorly. So spirituality is part of your inner world, but so is psychology. So is all of your behavior, your self-talk, your tendency to keep snapping at your spouse, your high stress. Why am I always so high strung that I can't sleep at night? What is all of that? And it's starting to peel back those layers a little bit at a time, usually in conjunction with some sort of practitioner, whether it's a therapist, a spiritual director, or someone who has some facility in those worlds. But you can also do it on your own. There are wonderful books and podcasts that can help you along the way. But being able to uncover what's driving you yields such a freedom. Like, oh, I don't have to feel like I'm a puppet on a string that when somebody pulls that string, then I have to freak out. You gain a sense of freedom in doing so.
I would imagine that people are hearing that term deconstruction and perhaps feeling some apprehension and fear, because a lot of times we aren't given permission to deconstruct, or we don't give ourselves the freedom to deconstruct because perhaps this way leads to chaos. I'm wondering, how do people address that reticence, that fear of deconstruction and what it might lead to in the worst sense?
I think what I'd first ask someone coming with those questions is to name what they're afraid of. To see, is it fear of losing those things? Like, am I afraid of my community having a freak out that I'm asking big questions or maybe drawing outside the lines a little bit? Or am I afraid of what that might mean about my identity? I mean, they are big questions. And anyone who's starting to have some of them bubble up interiorly, I highly recommend finding others who are in a similar space or a spiritual director that you trust that can walk with you through those questions, because they're important. We're human beings who have reason and capacity to ask questions and wonder and doubt and grapple, and that's an important part of the process. The wonderful reassurance is that nothing that is true is lost. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Deconstruction is really a process of kind of looking into that bathwater, if you want to use the analogy, and seeing like, okay, there's some muck in here that I don't really care to have as a part of my life. So let's scoop some of that out so that I can discover this baby, the beautiful, tender, incredible thing that is within all of this. And that's true in any religion. It doesn't just have to be Christianity, but oftentimes the beautiful spark at the center of any religion gets very crusted over. You kind of think of this volcano. There's this active, wild heart of it. But then there's also all this hardened lava encrusted everywhere. And you have to kind of peel all of that away in order to find that vibrant spark, the center again. So I say find a guide, and also find what is the core, what is that baby, what is that spark at the center that you fell in love with in the first place. Because deconstruction doesn't mean you're becoming an atheist by any means. I know a ton of people who have deconstructed and either still go to church, might have gone to a different church, or like had to approach things in a different way. There are plenty of people who are still deeply in love with Jesus or their spirituality or the divine. My own practice of Catholicism looks very different than it used to, but I feel more Catholic than I've ever been in many ways. But also that means something different to me now. And so when people ask me if I'm still Catholic, I'm like, yes, just kind of depends what you mean by that term. You can dwell at its mystical heart. And I think that's the big secret that's waiting for everyone, is that deep longing that you have. It can be found here as well. Like you can go east. A lot of people end up going east when they deconstruct, which is okay. But I'm really excited to share with people that there is a mystical heart to Christianity. And to me, that's the best kept secret in the world.
Now, importantly, your organization really is quite open-boundaried in terms of the traditions, the worldviews that people come to the community with. I think that too can be something that makes people nervous, is the idea, that somehow the validity of their own faith might be called into question, or they may not have the freedom and permission to express their views if they're with people who have different views. I wonder, how do you bring together folks of very different traditions around this thing that they're seeking, the sort of depth, this healing, this deconstruction, reconstruction cycle? How do you bring people together like that and reassure them that it's going to be okay?
Yeah. Fortunately, most people who stumble upon spiritual wanderlust are possessed with a longing, and that longing often is larger than any fear. That being said, I do understand that some folks are like, I don't know, is this going to be okay? Is it okay that I'm still Christian? And I'm like, 100%. A lot of us here are still Christian, and that's wonderful. The analogy that I like to use with folks is that of spiritual off-roading. I've used this. I have a program called Spiritual Off-Roading for folks who are hungry to basically step outside of the equivalent of spiritual suburbia. Most of us grow up in these Christian circles inside of white picket fences, essentially. We know exactly what's in and what's out, what's included, who's here. It's like the whole neighborhood has a very accepted color palette for the houses. You know every crack in the sidewalk. Everything is familiar to you, and you know how this world runs. And then all of a sudden, through no power of your own, you are dropped in the middle of the Yukon Territory, in the middle of a wilderness that is stunningly beautiful, but absolutely terrifying. You don't know how to live out there. You've never been. And so you're both excited to explore, but also kind of nervous about how in the world is this going to work. So what I love to do with Spiritual Wanderlust is to equip those kinds of people with the tools that they need to survive, because there are trails out there. You can follow the Buddhist trail, you can follow the Episcopalian trail, the Methodist trail, the spiritual but not religious trail. It doesn't matter to me so much. But anyone who is out there is going to need some very basic things like, how do I read my inner compass, trust my gut, and be able to discern and intuit and follow spirit or my gut or whatever you want to call it? What's the spiritual practice that I need out here? Like, what's the tent that I need to survive out here in the wild? And so finding those different tools and pieces of equipment is what I love to be able to equip people with, so they don't have to freak out or flail or feel so much terror, because it is wild, but it doesn't have to be terrifying.
Well, the current course you're offering this year is a series that you're calling Celtic Spirituality. Circlewood and Earthkeepers both have ideological roots in Celtic thought and practice, and that's in great part because of our founders, Tom and Christine Sine. I think it would be great to hear more about the Celtic Spirituality School and about some of the things that are being taught in that series.
Yes, absolutely. We're very excited about it because Celtic spirituality is such a great lens for entering into the contemplative, but also the embodied. The Celts are very good at both. And so you'll find things in embodiment like their rituals and their pilgrimages. You know, they had quite a sense of wanderlust. These monks would set forth in rudderless boats, just like, let's see where the spirit takes me, you know? So there's such beauty to that. And they had such a love and appreciation for nature, along with all the contemplative sides of things. Like, they loved silence. They were pretty extreme in things. They loved living on remote islands, and they had all sorts of interesting practices. You know, like there's this one monk, this hermit, who decided he was going to pray the Psalms in the middle of an icy stream at midnight, completely naked. You know, he was like, this is my extreme act for the Lord. So anyway, the Celts were just fascinating and looked very different than European Christianity in particular, because they were so rural and they just embraced the nature and the villages and all of that was already there. So in the Celtic Spirituality School, we're covering quite a bit of that, from Celtic pilgrimages to prayer, to the rituals, to the creativity, the music and songs, the art, the poetry. We have lots of really wonderful people coming to speak, from John Philip Newell to Ilia Delio, Esther de Waal, Sharon Blackie, who's the Jungian. She'll be speaking about myths and the other world and the hero's journey. We have this one woman coming who I'm very excited about. Saint Bridget is kind of a larger-than-life icon for the Celts, and she is a Bridgetine nun who lives in Kildare at the ancient site of Saint Bridget, who was also a goddess. And ever since ancient times, there was this flames of Kildare, of Saint Bridget. And in pagan times, it used to be like these virgins guarded the flame. And that flame existed for centuries and centuries, that it was guarded by these people until the English eventually smothered it out. But in the 70s, these Bridgetine nuns became the new keepers of the flame. And so I have the keeper of the flame of St. Bridget coming to speak about Bridget and the feminine in Celtic spirituality. So
Wow.
We're very excited about all of the people who are coming and the quality, because I find it sometimes difficult for folks who are ready to go beyond the introductory to find really robust formation, especially at an affordable price. So to be able to find something that's not a 2-year-long $20,000 program, but also for those who don't have a Carmelite monastery or a Zen monastery next door, to have access to this kind of formation.
And it can be more than just listening, right? I mean, there are other options for engagement, including sort of one-on-one counsel. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So people can choose if they want to just listen to the classes, which also involve spiritual practices. We commissioned an artist not far from you guys up in Washington who did a watercolor for each of the themes. So we have a guided Visio Divina, a certain kind of meditation that can go along with each. We have all of the materials for each. You can choose to engage in small groups if you want spiritual direction. There's various ways that you can engage with the material so that it becomes alive, because we don't want it to be just a head exercise. This is head and heart always, and body.
So you could tell me if I'm thinking straight here, but I'm having this moment of resonance when we think about that deconstruction, reconstruction cycle. It strikes me that in some ways the Celtic tradition was a deconstruction, reconstruction, macro movement. They did so much for the church in terms of rethinking, reframing, redefining. Do you think that's crazy?
I feel like the Celtic rebirth is part of that, but the Celts in the original, I feel like didn't really have a whole lot to deconstruct. And that's one of the unique things about the Celtic world is on much of the European continent, if there was something that didn't 100% agree with not only a church teaching, but how they were describing it, the language, all of that, they'd either burn you at the stake, call you a heretic, exile or excommunicate. There was just a lot of arguing and violence around that. The Celtic world never had any of that. They just had the let's transcend and include, let's look at what this pagan world offers. And we're like, of course we find the divine in nature. Duh. Of course we embrace the feminine and the masculine. That's obvious. Of course we include song and dance and art in our prayer. It was just second nature for them. So that's something that's very distinct about the Celtic world. So I don't think they had, at the beginning stage anyway, much to deconstruct.
Right.
But now that all of us are going through deconstruction and we're rediscovering that Christianity could look like that, that's where we're getting very excited and saying, oh, there's something else here. And I'm very, very excited about it.
So as a tradition, it's helping us to deconstruct and reconstruct. Yeah, giving us a framework. Well, I do have a question. We're talking about Celtic spirituality, and most of the stuff I've read couches that in a Christian framework. I'm wondering, how do you actually reframe that so that it's not exclusively Christian?
It's always a both and the Celts were great at that as well. So like I mentioned, there wasn't this tension between what came before and then Christianity coming. Oftentimes we think of Christian missionaries, especially in early America, coming, and there was a lot of bloodshed and violence and horrible things. And the Celtic world, it just seemed like they embraced Christianity. There is no history of conflict of any sort that we know of. And instead it was like, oh, God is 1 and 3? Yeah, 3 is important to us. That makes sense to us. Great. So there was a lot of continuity. Even the central role of the Druids, these Druids were like advisors and they were poets and bards. Like the role of a poet in the pre-Christian society was very important. They trained for anywhere between 10 and 20 years. And it was like a very respected thing. They advised kings and all these other people. The Christian monks kind of stepped right into that role. They became the advisors, the wise people, the poets, the artists, and the center of the community. And so there are some things that get intermingled, even that example of Saint Bridget. Bridget is the name of a pagan goddess and is the name of an actual historical Christian woman who became a very powerful woman. She was the abbess of a double monastery, so in charge of both men and women. So there were things that seem to flow with natural continuity from the pre-Christian into the Christian. So there is obviously some distinction, but a lot of it just flows so naturally that it feels very contiguous.
I'm curious, in particular, do you think there are elements of Celtic thought and practice that perhaps speak to how we might reimagine our relationship to the whole of creation, which of course for our listeners is a major question?
Yes. The Celts were so good at embracing nature. I love this story. There was this fellow, Alexander Carmichael, who in the 1800s recognized that Celtic culture was starting to die out, and the Celtic language and just all these practices, because it's an oral tradition, right? So very little has been written down. So he's like, I need to capture this. And so he went around Upper Scotland and different places in the Celtic lands and just started asking people for their prayers, their songs, their poetry, the things that they do. And so there's this one story that he tells of meeting an older gentleman who is in his late 70s. And he's like, what are your practices? How do you pray? And he's like, oh, I simply go wade out to my knees into the ocean and pray with the waves. I was like, it's that simple. Just doing what feels natural to us. It doesn't have to be some formalized spiritual practice with a name. Like, I am going to go do my Natura Divina, or have these very certain steps to my forest bathing. Those are all great and a good place to start if you feel kind of stumped. But other ways, I say just go where you feel drawn. If you have a certain relationship with an oak tree, by all means, spend time with that oak tree. You don't have to exchange verbal words, but again, there's that language that nature speaks that's so much deeper than that. And the Celts knew that there were certain places and trees and stones and locations that had, they called them thin spaces, that the veil between heaven and earth, the here and hereafter, was very thin. And so that's often where they had ceremonies, and churches at the beginning over there were in an oak grove. That was just their natural cathedral. So I think learning from both your own desires, where you feel most alive in nature, and it can be wherever, pay attention to that, because that's where the divine is already stirring. And the Celts show that you can find that anywhere. That's their core gift, I think, is finding the divine revealed everywhere around us, which is nothing new to your listeners.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's sort of an interesting irony. On the one hand, so many people, I believe, encounter God in nature, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where we are. That's the case. And at the same time, I think that some people have doubts about that, especially people who might come from a Christian tradition. There isn't language that they know that blesses that, right? There's not permission that frames that experience. And so I think for the most part, perhaps it goes unexplored, that potential to encounter God, encounter spirit in nature. So I'm really thrilled actually at this thought that Celtic Christians, Celtic traditions do give us a safe framework for that, and do give us permission and evidence that this was a life-giving element of Christian faith practice at one time.
Absolutely. And I'd say also just check out the Psalms. I feel like the psalmist is just so good at, or the canticle of Daniel, sun and moon, bless the Lord. And you can fill in your own canticle, make up your own litany, like whatever, branches and clouds, bless the Lord, moon and stars, bless the Lord, my crazy dog who won't stop, like, like barking in the background, bless the Lord. And to be able to engage with the words that even scripture passes down to us. It's not that it's not in the tradition, it's that our current incarnation of Christianity that so many were raised in has left behind much of tradition and even scripture, which is wild to me.
So I would imagine a lot of people come to you, especially now in post-COVID days, with maybe a sense of hopelessness or a struggle to find where it is they can place their hope. I'm wondering, where do you place your hope? What keeps you going at your work?
So what gives me hope, and how do I counsel others regarding hope? First of all, I often will advise people to do like a media examine, just to look at how much media we have bombarding us, because that can be so depressing and often only reflects the negative. I go onto my social media, I have Pinterest, right? And so Pinterest now knows that I care about the planet. And so it'll share all of these statistics that I'm like, oh, that is so overwhelming. But it doesn't really offer very many practical things to do, especially when you start learning like, oh, the biggest impacts on the world and on the climate is all of these massive corporations that we seem to have no control over. And so that can feel really big and overwhelming. So I'd say, one, find small things that you can do, whether it is plugging into a local group, like is there a watershed council where you are? Can you minimize the amount of plastic that you're using? Can you get out in nature and help others appreciate nature? Finding some place where you can have some agency, because what leads to compassion fatigue is when we see the enormity of what needs to be done and feeling powerless to do anything about it. So when we can actually have some sense of agency and do some small thing, that helps. But the other thing that gives me hope is this quote from the Talmud that really encourages me. And it says, don't be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now, love mercy now, walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And that feels so relieving to me because especially for those of us who feel deeply and empathize with just the pain of the planet and the animals and just everything that's going on around us, to recognize that I don't have to finish this. That's not my job. I'm not here to save the world, but I'm also not free to just abandon it and say like, well, whatever, I can't do anything. So to find that one small thing that you can do, find one thing each week if you can, whether it is getting yourself out in nature, sharing something on social media or with a friend, whatever it might be, that gives me hope.
We've been in conversation with Kelly Deutsch of Spiritual Wanderlust. If you want to discover more about opportunities for learning and spiritual guidance, or if you want to check out the Spiritual Wanderlust podcast, go to the show notes for this episode. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music, and Timothy Connor is our podcast editor. Our research assistant is Alex Megerly, and Jessalyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.